All right, today we're going to talk about ecology, which for those of you who had apes last year, it's all that same information. So, yes, you do have to watch the lecture, but you shouldn't have to study or stress about this unit. Couple definitions for you. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile young. So it's not only enough that tab A fits into slot B, but when they do have the genetics come together, that these genetics produce an offspring that itself can have children. A habitat is where this organism is living, the natural location of the organism. When you think habitat, think about like the habitat in a zoo. And so, if you were to design a habitat for an organism, what would you put in that zoo enclosure? So, if they ever on a test ask you about habitat, that's what they want you to do. Think about what would you put in a tiger enclosure that would describe the tiger's habitat. Population is a group of individuals of all the same species living in the same place at the same time. And you could have a population of snails in Rancho Santa Margarita, and a population of snails in Robinson, and a population of snooty snails in Kodo. They would all be distinct populations at that point because it's really hard for a snail to get from, RSM to behind the gates in Kodo. A community is everything within this ecosystem interacting. So, all of the living organisms, the dogs, the snails, the lizards, the plants, all of that coming together and interacting. An ecosystem is now all of the biotic and abiotic things in that area. And ecology is the study of how all of this interacts with each other. Heterotroph is something that has to eat another organism. Autotroph is something that makes its own energy through photosynthesis. A consumer is a heterotroph. A detrivore is something big like a California condor or a turkey vulture that's going to eat something that is already dead. Technically, you guys are all detrivores because very few of you are going out and killing something and eating it while it's alive. A saprotroph is something that lives in or on a dead organism. Mushrooms are saprotrophs. People get this wrong all the time, and it's kind of a stupid one to get wrong, but the initial source of all energy on the planet is the sun. And so when we talk about what's the initial source of energy for all food webs or food chains, the sun is it. You never draw the sun on your food chain or your food web. It's implied that it's there as a starting point of this energy. Energy is going to enter and leave the ecosystem. It's not recycled. Once it's gone, it's gone. And we often lose this heat, this energy to heat. Nutrients, on the other hand, are always recycled. And so when you die, plants are going to grow out of your dead body, recycling the nutrients that are in that body. Decomposers recycle the nutrients from other living organisms. Decomposers are put on Earth to make sure that all of this dead, decaying stuff doesn't build up. Food chain, simplest way of showing interactions within an ecosystem. One food choice at each trophic level, starting with the primary producers, which are your plants. They are eaten by primary consumers. These are your herbivores. Primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are eaten by tertiary consumers, and tertiary eaten by quaternary. Often we don't go above quaternary because there's not enough energy transfer. In general, we say on average 10% is transferring up the chain. If you were in apes last year with your little butterflies, you know that sometimes it's closer to 23%, depending on what you are. But on average, the number we use is 10%. You could be asked to construct a food web. You need to know 10 organisms, plants, and animals that would all be in the same ecosystem. Where people lose points on this one is if they put a polar bear roaming Southern California and eating jackrabbits. Never going to happen. And so the grader or me would give you 0 points for that. So make sure you know 10 organisms that all live in the same ecosystem. By the way, you can't just put plant, you need to know the name of a plant. Talked about trophic levels already. Um, You guys know how to apply them. So basically, the plants are the primary producers, herbivores or primary consumers. And then we have our secondary consumers eating primary, our tertiary eating secondary, and our quaternary eating tertiary. It is difficult to classify you as a primary consumer or a secondary consumer or a quaternary consumer because it really depends on your meal at that moment. You could be a primary consumer at breakfast, a secondary consumer at lunch, and a quaternary consumer at dinner. So you really have to trace individual food chains to apply trophic term labels. So few top predators because lack of energy at the top. Um, Only 10% transfers, yada, yada, yada. What happens to the other 90%? It's lost to heat. And when we say heat, it's not just like you're radiating off all this excess energy, but in addition to that, you have all of the heat that's generated through aerobic respiration when you are chasing down that bear that you're going to kill to eat. And so all of that heat that's generated through aerobic respiration represents that loss of energy. Also know that we very rarely eat every single piece of the organism that we're going to kill. And so that's some of that 90% that doesn't transfer as well. We're messy, messy eaters, and we can't digest everything that we eat. Energy is taken in by organisms and used for movement, cellular respiration, actions, bodily functions. Not all of it gets to transfer. You do need to know the units of an energy pyramid. I've never asked or seen you guys been asked to draw one, but I have seen a question about what are the units of it. So it's kilojoules per meter squared per year. Anytime you see this negative sign, it would normally be on the bottom of the divisor thingy. Make sure you watch this crash course on food webs. It will help. All right, feed conversion ratio. This is the ability to convert what you eat into the mass of your organism. And so those of you guys who are going into animal science, this was big in Animal Science 1 up at Davis is how do we make a bigger, fatter, more efficient cow? So what can I feed that cow so that that food doesn't just get pooped out, it actually gets turned into muscle. Muscle is where the money is if you're going to sell that animal. Gross production is the amount of organic material produced by photosynthesis in plants. Net production is the amount of gross production not used in plant respiration. All right, so think about it this way. Gross production is everything the plant makes for photosynthesis. Net is what's left over after the plant uses some. And you can see it does differ with what ecosystem you're in. And so you guys do kind of have to have an understanding of this chart. Best question here is which ecosystem is going to have the highest net primary productivity? Biomass is a number that we don't really use in science anymore, but it is the weight of an organism after we dehydrate it. And it's one of the ways of measuring how many things are out there. We can look at the biomass of plants or the biomass of ants. The problem with the number is that you have to kill something and dehydrate it, which when we talk about ecology and saving the environment and saving that, not a great number. We're not going to do this with an endangered species because it represents killing a portion of the endangered species. Succession is the gradual change over time. Two types of succession, primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession, there's never been any life there before. Think about new islands in the South Pacific that emerge up and all of a sudden it's land and there's never been anything living on this land. And so you go through primary succession. It's slow because you have to first have things like lichen that are going to develop the soil before you can get plants that live in the soil. And then you have to get plants big enough to have a complex community. Secondary succession is what you see happening in our hills all over now that the fire has gone through. So there's been life. And so we have soil already, we have seeds already. Animals come back relatively quickly. Please watch both videos that are linked here. When we go through succession, pioneer species are the first species to appear. It's often lichen, which is what you see down here on this rock. It looks like a discoloration, but it actually is a type of photosynthetic organism that has enzymes that will break down the rock. And as it breaks down the rock, it creates soil. As succession goes on, primary productivity increases in the area. Make sure you look at this slide. If you're asked to compare primary and secondary succession, you can draw this table. Factors that affect plant distribution. Temperature. Each plant has an optimum temperature based on the fact that photosynthesis is an enzyme-driven process. And so based on where these plants evolved, they're going to have different temperatures that they like. Different water needs. So, you've got the xerophytes and the hydrophytes, and then just our normal phytes, our normal plants. They all have different water needs and different amounts of light, depending on where that plant evolved. Soil pH and salinity will affect where a plant lives based on the osmotic values here. And then the minerals are going to be important. Things that affect animal distribution. So temperature, things have ideal temperature range. Ideally, things are going to live between freezing and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the most comfortable, where you're going to see the most species. Now, we do have some that live below freezing and some that live above 100, but it becomes rarer. Territory, animals are very territorial, and so they are going to limit what other organisms can be in the area. If you've ever taken your dog on a walk and they're marking every bush and tree, they're trying to establish their territory and say, hey, I own this, don't come into my area. Water, the amount of water differs among species, but some water is needed by all. So if you have a desert, you're going to have very few species because there's very little water in that desert. Animals need breeding sites, and so you have to have a certain number of breeding sites for each organism. And once those breeding sites are out, then you've pretty much reached carrying capacity. Same for food. Just a couple of pictures of marking. Crash course competition is really good to read or watch. Tolerance is the ability to survive with limited food or limited water. And when we talk about this, we're going to have a range of tolerance. That range of tolerance on the outside of each part of that range, that's your fundamental niche. That's areas where you could live. The optimum range, that blue section of this graph, that's going to be your realized niche. The majority of your organisms are going to live within an area that it's easy to get food, it's easy to get water, it's easy to get shelter, it's easy to get breeding sites. You might have a few scragglers out there in that fundamental niche where they can live, but life is a little bit harder. Competitive exclusion is when competition occurs, only the best suited are going to survive and outcompete all the rest. Organisms are often going to divide into niches called resource partitioning. And so you can have a bunch of different birds all within the same area because they're going to eat different parts of the tree or forage in different areas. You cannot have a ton of birds in one area all foraging off the same area because then you run out of supplies. A keystone species is a species whose removal will have a profound impact on the environment. The example here is the sea otter. Sea otters actually allowed our kelp forests to thrive because they ate sea urchins. Sea urchins eat kelp. Well, when we hunted the otter to extinction or near extinction in Southern California for its pelt, all of a sudden the urchins had no predator. The urchins took over and we lost a good majority of our kelp beds. Well, the kelp beds are a unique ecosystem for hundreds of different species. The idea of a niche is the role that an organism plays in its ecosystem. It includes a spatial habitat, an area where the organism lives and its abiotic features. And it also includes the predator-prey relationships and biological features. If you are asked on a test to describe the niche of an organism, it is what it eats, where it lives, and what eats it. Make sure you include those three things. Again, we talked about fundamental niche and realized niche. Guys, fundamental niche, I could look at you and say, any of you can be anything you want. You can be president, you could be astronaut, whatever. Realized niche is what you actually end up being at the end of the day. So I could have been anything I wanted to be, but my realized niche is a teacher. Competition, two or more organisms competing for the same resource, and occurs between species or between two different species or within the same species. And it increases when there is a shared habitat due to human encroachment or when there is a limited resource like food or mating. Herbivory might be a new term for you. It's the eating of plants. And so any bug that's going to eat a plant, we call it herbivory. And then predation is one organism eating another. Parasitism, one organism living in or on another causing harm. And mutualism is a long lasting relationship where two organisms thrive off of each other. So they are both benefiting from the relationship. If you really want, there are some parasite movies. I'm really into parasites, and normally I would torture you in a good year. Random sampling, you can sample with a quadrant, which is a wire shaped into a square of known size, and you throw that quadrant out. And when you throw that quadrant out, you measure or count everything within that quadrant. And then you pick up your quadrant and you throw out again, and you measure anything in that quadrant, and you average what you've counted. And once you've averaged it, then you extrapolate out to the whole area. It gives us an estimate of population size. It's not going to give us the exact population, but it's a pretty good estimate. And here is quadrant sampling. So I know how big my field is, and then I get a quadrant of known size, and I sample maybe 10 times, and I count everything in this quadrant. I average those 10 quadrants together, and then I extrapolate out that number to the full size of the field. Sometimes we're going to do this along a transect if we want to know how things change along an abiotic gradient. So from like low tide to high tide, or from low elevation to high elevation, we could draw a line and then sample on either side of that line.